The storm came suddenly, rolling across the plains with a fury that rattled the windows and bent the tall grass flat against the earth. Rain beat against the roof in heavy sheets, and thunder cracked so loud it shook the rafters of the Hale ranch house. Thomas had just finished securing the barn doors when he came inside, dripping wet. The lamp in the sitting room flickered, casting a soft glow. Eleanor was there, standing stiffly by the window, veil trembling with each flash of lightning. She had never looked so small, so fragile. Her hands gripped the fabric of her skirt until her knuckles whitened. The storm seemed to unmoor something deep in her, a terror she could not quite contain. "Eleanor," Thomas said gently, setting his hat aside. "It's only a storm. Nothing here can harm you." Her breath came quick, shallow. "You don't know that?" she whispered, her voice trembling like the glass panes under the thunder's roar. He stepped closer, careful not to startle her. "You're safe. I promise you. Nothing will touch you while I'm here." She shook her head, turning slightly away. "You cannot promise what you do not know." Something in her words struck him like a blow. It wasn't the storm she feared, not truly. It was life itself, the world, the cruelty of eyes and judgment. And she carried it alone, wrapped up tight in fabric and silence. "Eleanor," he said softly, his voice steady as the rain outside. "You've nothing to fear from me." Her hands trembled at her sides. "You say that now. But when you see," her voice broke, "when you see, you'll look at me like all the others did." Thomas's heart ached at her confession. He had waited weeks, held back his questions, but in that moment, something told him the time for patience had passed. He could not let her drown in her own shame forever. Slowly, deliberately, he reached out. "Let me look at you, Eleanor. Not as others have." "As your husband." She stepped back, shaking her head. "No, please, no." But the plea was not defiance, it was fear. And fear, Thomas knew, could not be met with force, only gentleness. He lifted his hands, moving slowly as though approaching a wild creature ready to bolt. When she did not retreat further, he touched the edge of her veil. "Trust me," he murmured. For a long, trembling moment, she stood frozen. Then, at last, she gave the faintest nod. With infinite care, Thomas drew the veil back. The fabric slipped away, revealing the face beneath, pale from years of hiding, framed by dark hair that curled softly at her temples. Her features were delicate, almost too fine for the rough land she now lived in. But it was her eyes that held him still, wide, luminous, and filled with both fear and sorrow. Thomas's breath caught. Not scars, not deformity, not shame, beauty. But not the shallow beauty that drew whistles and envy. Hers was the kind that broke a man's heart with its honesty. And yet, behind that beauty, he saw the pain she carried like a wound that would not heal. Eleanor turned her face aside, tears spilling down her cheeks. "You see now," she whispered bitterly. "This is why I cover myself. Because beauty brings nothing but ruin. Men want what they should not. Women despise what they cannot have. My own kin cursed me for the trouble it brought. Do you see now why I must hide?" Thomas's chest ached at her words. He lifted a hand, not to restrain but to comfort, brushing a tear from her cheek with the gentleness of a man touching something sacred. "What I see," he said quietly, "is a woman burdened by the cruelty of others. Not cursed, not ruined. You are not shame, Eleanor. You are more than they ever let you believe." She looked at him then, startled, as though she had expected condemnation and found instead something she could not name. The storm outside raged on, but within the quiet of the sitting room, something shifted between them. The veil lay forgotten at her feet, and for the first time, husband and wife stood face to face. No secrets, no fabric, only truth. And though Eleanor's tears still fell, Thomas thought she had never looked more beautiful. The storm passed in the night, leaving the land damp and quiet. By dawn, the sky was pale blue, washed clean by rain. But inside the Hale ranch house, a different storm lingered. Eleanor had not slept. After Thomas lifted her veil, after she saw no judgment in his eyes, something inside her cracked open. She could not return to silence now. When Clara went to town the next morning, Eleanor lingered in the sitting room, veil folded carefully in her lap. Her hands twisted in the fabric as though unsure whether to keep it or cast it into the fire. Thomas entered quietly, carrying 2 mugs of coffee. He set one before her, then sat across from her, waiting. She stared at the dark liquid, then at her hands. Finally, her voice came low but steady. "You must think me foolish. A wife who hides from her own husband." Thomas shook his head. "I think you've been hurt." "More than you let on." Her lips pressed together, trembling slightly, and then the words spilled out. "Since I was a girl, people looked at me and saw only a face. Not a person, not a soul, just something to envy or to covet." She paused, fingers clenching the veil. "My mother called me vain, even when I avoided mirrors. My friends grew jealous, accusing me of trying to steal attention. But the worst was my own kin. My cousin, he was supposed to be my protector. Instead," her voice faltered. She swallowed hard. "He tried to take what was not his to take. When I fought him, he said it was my fault that I tempted him. And my parents believed him. They told me I had brought shame upon the family, that I had invited sin." Her breath hitched. Tears welled in her eyes, but she forced herself to continue. "From then on, I vowed never to be seen again. I covered myself so no man could accuse me, no woman could despise me. Better they whisper I was ugly than call me wicked for something I never chose." Thomas's hands tightened around his mug, jaw clenched. The thought of anyone harming her, let alone kin, filled him with quiet rage. Yet he kept his voice calm. "Eleanor," he said softly, "none of that was your fault. A man's sin is his own. The guilt lies with him, not you." She shook her head, despair flickering in her eyes. "You say that now. But once you've lived with the consequences of beauty, once you've seen how it poisons hearts, you'll understand why I cover myself." Thomas leaned forward, resting his hands on the table, his gaze steady. "I don't need to understand every shadow of your past to know this. Your face is not a curse. It's not what makes you who you are. I've seen you work, care, serve, pray. That's who you are, not the way others treated you." She looked at him, truly looked at him, for perhaps the first time. His eyes held no hunger, no envy, only steady, quiet conviction. It unsettled her more than cruelty ever had, because she had never known what it was to be seen without being judged. Her voice softened to a whisper. "Do you mean it, Thomas? That you don't see me as they did?" He reached across the table and took her trembling hands in his. "I see you as my wife, not a burden. Not a temptation, just Eleanor." For a long moment, the only sound was the ticking of the clock on the mantel. Eleanor's tears fell freely now, but they were not the bitter tears of shame. They were tears of release, as though some of the chains she had carried for years were loosening. She had revealed her truth, the wound she had hidden behind cloth and silence, and instead of recoiling, Thomas had remained. For the first time in years, Eleanor felt the faint flicker of something dangerous and beautiful. Hope. The morning after Eleanor's confession, the air on the ranch felt strangely lighter, as though the land itself shared in her release. But inside her chest, the heaviness still lingered. Though she had spoken the truth of her past, doubt gnawed at her. What if Thomas's patience was only temporary? What if, like everyone else, he eventually turned cold? She sat at the table, veil folded but not worn, when Thomas returned from tending the horses. Dust clung to his boots and sweat dampened his shirt, yet his eyes went first to her, as though checking she was still there, still safe. Eleanor lowered her gaze, uncertain how to meet that kind of attention. "Eleanor," he said gently, removing his hat, "there's something I need to say." Her breath caught. A knot of fear tightened in her stomach. Perhaps this was the moment he would tell her she was too broken, too much trouble. But when he pulled out the chair across from her, his expression was not rejection. It was resolve. "I heard what you told me yesterday," he began, "and I can't change what was done to you, but I can make you a promise." She looked up, her hands gripping the edge of the table. His voice was steady, carrying the weight of a man who rarely spoke without meaning every word. "You will never face shame in this house again," he said. "Not from me, not from anyone. I don't care what others whispered before. Here you are safe. Here you are honored. And as long as I draw breath, no man will ever raise a hand or word against you without answering to me." The sheer conviction in his tone made her chest ache. She shook her head half in disbelief. "You can't promise that. The world doesn't change because you wish it." "No," he admitted, leaning forward, "but I can stand between you and it. I can take the weight you've been carrying alone. That's what a husband ought to do." Her lips trembled, and she clasped her hands tightly together to keep them from shaking. "And if one day you tire of me? If my fears become too much? If the whispers in town turn against us?" Thomas's gaze did not waver. "Then let them whisper. They don't feed me, they don't keep this ranch. I married you, Eleanor, not their approval." Her throat tightened. She wanted to believe him, wanted to lean into the shelter of those words. But years of scorn had built walls inside her, and they did not crumble easily. "You make it sound simple," she whispered. He gave a small, tired smile, the kind of smile that came from long days in the sun. "It is simple. Folks make it harder than it needs to be. A marriage isn't about what the world thinks. It's about keeping faith with each other." Silence fell between them, heavy but not suffocating. Eleanor searched his face, looking for cracks in his resolve, but all she found was plain, honest truth. No flattery. No false promises. Just a vow forged as sturdy as the beams of the house he'd built with his own hands. Her eyes blurred with tears she hadn't realized were gathering. Slowly, she reached across the table, laying her hand over his. It was a small gesture, tentative, but for her it was as daring as walking into fire. His hand closed over hers, rough and calloused yet warm, grounding her in a way she had never known. "You would do that?" she asked softly. "Carry what I cannot?" "Yes," he said without hesitation. "Because you are my wife, and I'll spend my life proving you never have to hide again." The words sank deep, not just into her mind, but into the places of her heart that had long been starved of tenderness. She felt the faintest stirring of something she had thought lost forever, a sense of safety, perhaps even belonging. For the first time since she had stepped off the wagon, veil in place, Eleanor allowed herself to believe she might not have to live the rest of her life in hiding, and it was because of him, because Thomas Hale had not only seen her, but vowed to protect what others had broken. The days that followed Thomas's vow were different. Though nothing outwardly changed in the running of the ranch. The horses still needed tending, the fields mending, meals cooked, and laundry hung. Yet for Eleanor, every small task carried a new weight and a new lightness. Her veil lay folded in a drawer now, untouched. At first she felt naked without it, as though the air itself burned against her skin. When she walked past a mirror, she turned her head quickly, afraid of her own reflection. But Thomas's words, steady and unwavering, echoed in her heart. "You never have to hide again." One morning, Clara returned from town with a basket of supplies. Eleanor was in the kitchen, sleeves rolled up, her hair tied back, sunlight spilling across her uncovered face. Clara stopped short in the doorway, nearly dropping the basket. "Eleanor," she whispered, eyes wide. Eleanor froze, shame flooding her veins. Instinct told her to reach for the drawer, to cover herself, to retreat. But then she saw Thomas step in behind Clara, his gaze finding hers. He gave the faintest nod, a quiet reminder that she was safe. Taking a steadying breath, Eleanor straightened her shoulders. "I thought," she said softly, "that perhaps it was time I stopped hiding." Clara blinked, then smiled, her eyes misting over. "It's about time," she said, setting the basket down with a thud. "You're as lovely as a sunrise, Eleanor. Folks will see it too, and maybe that will finally teach them something." The words struck Eleanor deep, not as flattery, but as acceptance. For the first time, another woman's eyes did not carry envy or scorn. Instead, Clara's gaze held warmth. It was a small victory, but to Eleanor, it felt like the beginning of a new life. That Sunday, Thomas asked her to ride into town with him for church. The very idea made Eleanor tremble. Faces, stares, whispers, she could already hear them in her mind. But Thomas's hand was steady on hers as he said, "If you're ready, we'll go together. And if anyone dares speak against you, they'll have to reckon with me. So she went. The town square was bustling, wagons rattling, children laughing, women calling to one another. As Thomas helped her down from the wagon, heads turned. Conversations faltered. Some eyes widened, others narrowed. Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks, her fingers tightening around Thomas's arm. But then she heard him say in a voice meant for all to hear, "This is my wife, Eleanor Hale." No shame, no hesitation, just truth. A few whispers rippled through the crowd, but no harsh words came. A few women nodded politely, a few men tipped their hats. And though Eleanor still felt the weight of every gaze, she realized something remarkable. The world had not ended. The ground had not opened to swallow her whole. As they walked into the small wooden church, Thomas's arm steady beneath hers, Eleanor lifted her chin a little higher. Each step felt like reclaiming ground she had lost long ago. During the hymn, she sang quietly, her voice trembling but clear. For years she had been silent in the back pew, afraid to draw notice. Now, though her heart pounded, she let her voice be heard. Beside her, Thomas sang low and steady, anchoring her in the sea of sound. When the service ended, an elderly woman touched Eleanor's arm gently and said, "You've got the kindest eyes, dear. Don't let anyone tell you different." It was such a simple thing, but it nearly undid her. For kindness, freely given, was rarer than gold in her memory. That night, back at the ranch, Eleanor stood on the porch watching the sun sink behind the hills. The sky blazed with streaks of orange and rose, and the air smelled of rain-soaked earth. Thomas joined her, slipping an arm around her shoulders. "You did well today," he murmured. "I was terrified," she admitted. "And yet you stood tall," he said, pressing a kiss to her hair. "That's all courage is, being afraid and choosing to stand anyway." Eleanor leaned into him, her heart quiet for the first time in years. She had thought shame would follow her to the grave. Yet here she was, unveiled, seen, and cherished. For the first time since girlhood, she dared to believe that her life was not cursed, but blessed. And as the stars blinked into the darkening sky, Eleanor knew her story was not one of shame, but of redemption. With Thomas by her side, she was no longer the hidden bride. She was simply herself, uncovered, unashamed, and finally free. The land stretched wide and golden under the late summer sun, but to Thomas Hale the ranch felt emptier than ever. A widower at 35, he had buried both parents, then a young wife who died during childbirth, leaving him with no children and only silence to fill the house. The ranch hands respected him. The town admired his hard work, but behind closed doors, Thomas knew loneliness had become his constant shadow. It was his sister, Clara, who finally urged him to consider remarriage. Clara worried about his health, his meals, and his spirit. "You need someone, Tom?" she insisted one evening as they sat in the lamplight. "Not just for the ranch, though Lord knows it could use a woman's touch, but for your heart." After weeks of resisting, he finally agreed to let Clara write to an acquaintance in St. Louis who arranged marriages between frontier men and women seeking new lives. He did not ask for beauty or wealth. He asked only for a woman of kindness and strength, someone who would not fear the hardships of ranch life. Months passed, and one afternoon a telegram arrived. His bride was on the way. She would arrive by wagon at the end of the month. Thomas felt a knot twist in his stomach, not of excitement but of unease. He knew nothing of this woman, only that she was willing. What if she was unwilling when she saw his hardened features, his scar across the jaw earned in a cattle accident, or the vast loneliness of his land? The day came heavy with dust and wind. Thomas hitched his wagon and rode to town. At the depot, the small group of onlookers whispered, curious about the rancher's mail-order bride. Then the stagecoach arrived in a cloud of dust, and among the passengers stepped a slender figure draped in gray, her face hidden beneath a thick veil. She clutched a small satchel, nothing more, and her hands trembled as she descended. "Mr. Hale?" she asked softly, her voice nearly lost in the noise of the horses. He tipped his hat, taken aback by the timid sound of her words. "Yes, ma'am." "You must be Miss Eleanor." She nodded once but did not lift her veil. Some townsfolk muttered behind their hands. Why would she hide her face so completely? Thomas ignored them, offered his arm, and helped her into his wagon. The ride back was quiet. He asked polite questions, how her journey was if she had eaten, but she answered briefly, her head bowed. The veil fluttered slightly in the breeze, but never enough for him to glimpse what lay beneath. That evening, the preacher met them at the small chapel. The ceremony was brief, with Clara as the sole witness. Eleanor kept her face lowered the entire time, and when Thomas was instructed to kiss the bride, she shifted slightly, allowing only the faintest brush of contact through fabric. The preacher hesitated, surprised, but said nothing. Thomas felt a pang in his chest. He had not asked for a beauty, but nor had he expected a wife so determined to hide herself. Still, he reminded himself of his vow. He had promised to take her as she was, sight unseen. Afterward, as they returned to the ranch house under a blanket of stars, Eleanor sat quietly, her veil pale in the moonlight. He stole a glance at her hands folded in her lap. They were delicate, uncalloused, yet firm, as though they belonged to a woman who had endured far more than her frame suggested. In that moment, Thomas understood two things. His bride was deeply ashamed of something, and their journey together would be far more complicated than a mere contract on paper. The ranch house loomed quietly against the open plains as Thomas guided his new bride through the door. Clara had prepared a supper of roasted chicken and bread, but Eleanor, still veiled, ate little, murmuring polite thanks before excusing herself. Clara watched her with raised brows but said nothing, sensing her brother's unease. When the door to the guest room closed behind Eleanor, Clara leaned close to Thomas. "What's wrong with her, Tom? She won't even lift her veil." Thomas sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "I don't know. Maybe she's shy. Maybe she's—" He stopped himself before speaking the doubts he didn't wish to voice. Scarred, diseased, or worse, hiding a past she was ashamed of. That night, long after the house settled, Eleanor sat alone by the small window in her room. The moonlight filtered through her veil as she pulled it back just enough to breathe. Her face was not ruined nor marked, but smooth and striking. Her eyes, large, dark, and heavy with memory, gleamed with a sorrow that never left her. She pressed her hands together, whispering, "Please, Lord, let him never see me as they did." Since her girlhood, Eleanor's beauty had been both a gift and a curse. It had drawn admiring glances she never sought, envy from other women, and suspicion from wives who accused her of tempting their husbands. When her own cousin betrayed her trust and tried to claim her by force, her family blamed her for inviting attention. From that day forward, Eleanor swore never again to let her face bring ruin. The veil became her refuge, a shield against eyes that judged, desired, or despised. She had agreed to this arranged marriage with one hope, that the rancher who took her would accept her silence and respect her coverings. She wanted a home, safety, and perhaps a measure of peace, nothing more. Love was a dream too dangerous to hope for. Over the next week, Thomas noticed small things that puzzled him. Eleanor moved quietly through the house, her steps soft as a whisper. She kept her veil on even while washing dishes or carrying laundry. If the fabric slipped, she adjusted it quickly, as though terrified someone might glimpse what lay beneath. And yet, despite her concealment, she proved capable in ways that surprised him. She mended torn shirts with careful stitches, tended the garden Clara had neglected, and once, when a calf wandered too near the creek, she rushed after it without hesitation, lifting her skirts and guiding it back to safety. Thomas saw no vanity in her, no pride, only diligence and a strange humility. One afternoon, when Clara tried to coax her into conversation, Eleanor smiled faintly beneath the fabric. "I prefer not to trouble anyone with myself," she said. "Nonsense," Clara replied kindly. "You're family now." But Eleanor's hands trembled and she lowered her gaze. "Family has never been a mercy to me." The words lingered with Thomas that night. Who was this woman? What shadows haunted her past that she felt safer hidden from the world? He found himself watching her with increasing curiosity, not because he doubted her worth, but because he wanted to understand. And yet, he restrained himself. He knew too well that trust could not be forced. The land had taught him patience, the seasons moved in their own time, and crops could not be rushed. Perhaps this marriage would be the same. Still, a question gnawed at him. Was she veiled because of what she feared others would see, or because of what she feared in herself? Eleanor, alone in her room that night, pulled the veil from her face once more, stared at her reflection in the cracked mirror and whispered, "Better unseen than hated again." The secret was not her face. It was the shame of being desired for it, punished for it, and never loved for who she truly was. The marriage was spoken, vows exchanged, rings slipped into place. And yet, Thomas realized, he had not truly met his wife. He knew her name, Eleanor. He knew her soft, restrained voice. He knew the shape of her hands, pale and slender beneath the edge of her sleeve. But her face, the very mark of her presence, remained hidden. That first evening as husband and wife, the silence between them felt heavier than the August heat. Clara had retired early, sensing the awkwardness. The oil lamp burned low on the dining table, casting long shadows across the walls. Thomas cleared his throat, trying to bridge the distance. "You must be weary from your travels," he said, folding his hands on the table. "It's a long road from St. Louis." Eleanor, seated opposite him, gave a small nod. "Yes, sir." It was long, the sir stung. "You needn't call me that," he said gently. "Thomas will do, or Tom, if you like." Her hands folded tightly together in her lap. "Yes, Thomas." The word came faint, almost rehearsed. A silence followed. He tried again. "Did you leave family behind?" Her veil dipped as she lowered her gaze further. "No family worth naming." Thomas frowned but did not press. Something in her voice warned him that the subject was edged with pain. Instead, he gestured toward the small loaf of bread she had barely touched. "You'll need strength if you're to settle in here. Ranch life can be hard. I'll manage," she whispered. He believed her. There was steel beneath her softness, he could hear it. But why the veil? Why the shield between them? Later, when he showed her to the larger bedroom prepared for them both, she hesitated at the threshold. He understood at once what she feared. "If you'd prefer your own chamber," he said slowly, "you may, until you feel ready." Relief flickered in the slight dip of her shoulders. "Thank you," she murmured, slipping into the smaller guest room with her satchel. That night, Thomas lay awake in his bed, staring at the ceiling beams. The house, once silent with loneliness, was now silent with mystery. Who was Eleanor, really? Why had she come to him, covered as though she carried shame? Was she afraid of him or of the world itself? The next morning, Thomas rose early to tend the horses. When he returned, he found breakfast already on the table, fresh eggs, buttered biscuits, and coffee. Clara looked impressed, sipping from her cup. "She was up before dawn," she whispered. Quiet as a church mouse, but steady. Eleanor emerged from the kitchen, sleeves rolled slightly, hands dusted with flour. The veil remained, of course, but Thomas caught a glimpse of her wrist, slender, elegant, marked faintly with the shadow of a bruise long since faded. She caught him looking, quickly lowered her arm, and busied herself with pouring coffee. "Thank you," he said softly when she placed the cup before him. She inclined her head but said nothing. Throughout the day, he observed her moving about the ranch house, each step measured, as though she were determined not to intrude upon anyone. She spoke little, but her actions spoke volumes. Her care with the dishes, her way of folding laundry with practiced precision, the soft humming he overheard once while she swept the porch. It struck Thomas that while she remained veiled to him, she was not closed to the life around her. She worked, she served, she breathed quietly but steadily, as though trying to stitch herself into the fabric of his home without ever drawing attention. That evening, as the sun sank into a blaze of orange across the prairie, he found her sitting by the window with sewing in her hands. The veil caught the last light, glowing faintly. He wanted to ask her then why she hid, what she feared, but something in her posture stopped him. She was a stranger still, and trust was not a thing to be demanded. Instead, he sat across from her, silent, listening to the crickets outside. It was not much, but it was their first meeting, not in vows or contracts, but in the quiet space of shared presence. And in that fragile silence, Thomas understood. He had married a woman wrapped not only in fabric but in secrets. The days that followed settled into a rhythm, though not without their strangeness. For Thomas, life on the ranch had always been marked by toil and silence. With Eleanor there, the silence remained, but it had changed its character, no longer empty but guarded, like a secret that hovered in the air. From the very first morning, Eleanor proved herself diligent. Though she said little, her actions spoke more than words ever could. The house, which Clara had struggled to keep orderly while also tending to the accounts and garden, seemed to transform under Eleanor's hands. Curtains were washed and rehung, the kitchen organized, floors swept until they shone. Even Clara, who had braced herself to bear the burden of teaching a city woman frontier ways, was left surprised. "She knows her way around a home better than most women out here," Clara admitted one afternoon as she shelled peas beside Thomas on the porch. "Still, she won't let that veil slip, not even when it's just us," Thomas grunted. "Maybe she'll come to it in her own time." But privately, he wondered how long he could live with a wife whose face he had never seen. Outdoors, Eleanor was more hesitant. The wide, open land seemed to unsettle her. She walked the yard cautiously, veil fluttering in the breeze, and rarely ventured beyond the immediate fence. Yet she did not shy from work when it was needed. When Clara showed her how to tend the chickens, Eleanor knelt in the dust, gathering eggs with careful hands. She learned to churn butter, to feed the hogs, to string beans for drying. At times, Thomas caught her watching him as he rode in from the pastures, though she always lowered her head when he looked her way. He began to notice the small things, the graceful bend of her wrist as she poured water, the way her shoulders straightened when Clara praised her cooking, the gentle hum of hymns that drifted from the kitchen when she thought no one was near. The ranch hands, however, were less discreet. Their curiosity about the veiled bride grew by the day. At supper one evening, while Thomas sat with them at the bunkhouse table, one man whispered, "Maybe she's hiding scars, or worse. A woman don't cover herself like that unless she's got something to hide." Thomas slammed his cup down harder than intended. "That woman is my wife," he said, his voice low but sharp. "You'll speak of her with respect, or you'll find another place to earn your bread." The men fell silent after that. Though Thomas knew their whispers would carry elsewhere, into town, into the ears of neighbors who loved gossip as much as grain. Meanwhile, within the home, Eleanor kept her careful distance. At night, she retired to her own room, though she always left a lamp burning until the small hours. Some nights, Thomas heard her pacing softly, as though wrestling with thoughts too heavy for rest. One evening, a summer storm broke over the plains. Rain lashed the windows, thunder rolled across the horizon. Thomas found Eleanor in the kitchen, standing rigid as the lightning lit the room. She clutched the edge of the counter, veil trembling with her breath. "Storms trouble you?" he asked gently. She startled, then nodded once. "They remind me of other things." He wanted to ask what things, but her voice was fragile, and he feared pressing her would shatter what little trust she held. Instead, he simply said, "You're safe here." She looked at him through the fabric. He couldn't see her eyes clearly, yet he felt the weight of her gaze. For the first time since her arrival, she did not retreat immediately. She lingered in the kitchen as the storm raged, her presence beside him a quiet, wordless truce. Life on the ranch was beginning to bind them together, not through passion or conversation, but through the daily labor of survival. And though her veil remained, Thomas sensed that Eleanor's heart was slowly stitching itself to the land, and perhaps, just perhaps, to him. The small frontier town had a way of magnifying everything. A calf born with 2 white patches was spoken of for weeks. A broken fence became the talk of the mercantile. And so it was no surprise that the arrival of Thomas Hale's veiled bride had become a favorite subject among the townsfolk. At first, it was only curiosity. When Eleanor accompanied Clara on errands, her gray veil turned heads as they walked through the general store. Mothers tugged children closer, while old men squinted as though they might see through the cloth if only they stared hard enough. Eleanor kept her head lowered, shoulders drawn tight, clutching her basket as if it were a shield. Whispers stirred wherever she passed. Why would she cover herself so? Perhaps she's scarred. Burns, maybe. Or hiding a cleft lip. Or worse. Some say she was disgraced back east and the veil hides her shame. Eleanor heard them all, though none dared speak directly. Each word fell like a stone into her chest, reminding her why she had chosen to remain hidden. It was safer to be called disfigured than to be seen as she truly was. Beauty, in her experience, had brought far crueler whispers. Clara noticed the stares as well. One afternoon, after buying flour, she leaned toward Eleanor and muttered, "Pay them no mind. This town feeds on gossip. They'll find someone else to peck at soon enough." But they didn't. The veil was too unusual, too constant. Each trip into town renewed the questions. One Saturday, Thomas rode in with Eleanor beside him to collect supplies. As they tied the wagon near the blacksmith, a ranch hand from a neighboring spread smirked and called out, "Hey, Hale, what you got under there? A ghost? Or did you marry a scarecrow?" Laughter followed. Before Eleanor could flinch, Thomas turned sharply, eyes cold. "That's my wife you're speaking of." His voice carried across the street, firm as steel. The laughter died. The ranch hand looked away, muttering something about touchy pride. Eleanor's hands trembled in her lap. Shame burned her cheeks beneath the fabric, though Thomas could not see. She wanted to flee back to the safety of the ranch, but instead she forced herself to sit still, to endure. Inside the mercantile, the shopkeeper's wife offered a strained smile. "It must be hot beneath that veil, dear. Surely you'd be more comfortable without it," Eleanor answered softly. "I am comfortable as I am." "Ma'am," the woman sniffed, clearly unsatisfied, and hurried to fetch the sugar Clara had requested. Later, as Thomas loaded the supplies, he muttered under his breath, "They don't know you." "They don't have the right." Eleanor's throat tightened. She wanted to tell him that she wasn't angry at the whispers. She was afraid of what would happen if the veil ever came off. She wanted to say, "If they think me ugly, at least they leave me be." But if they saw, it would be worse. Instead, she only whispered, "People will always wonder." Best they don't know. That evening, back at the ranch, Thomas sat on the porch with Clara after Eleanor retired early. "They talk about her," he admitted, jaw tense. "Say she's hiding something." Clara studied her brother quietly. "And what if she is? You sent for a wife, Tom. You didn't send for answers. You'll have to decide if you trust her heart before you demand her face." Her words stayed with him. He defended Eleanor fiercely, yet in the quiet hours of the night he couldn't deny the truth. Part of him did wonder. Who was the woman he had married, hidden behind layers of cloth? And yet each day when she placed food on the table, or hummed softly while mending clothes, or tended to the small details of the home, he felt something growing in him that had little to do with appearances. Still, the whispers in town sharpened his longing to know. Was she hiding shame, or was she hiding herself from a world too cruel to see her as she truly was? The summer days lengthened, and the rhythm of the ranch held steady. Mornings filled with the lowing of cattle, afternoons heavy with heat, evenings softened by the song of crickets. To an outsider, life on the Hale Ranch might have looked peaceful. Yet within its walls, something unspoken lingered between Thomas and his veiled bride. Eleanor kept her veil with unwavering discipline. She rose before dawn, worked beside Clara through the day, and retired early, always careful not to reveal more than her gloved hands or the faint outline of her features. She rarely spoke unless spoken to, and when she did, her voice was soft, as if carrying secrets in every syllable. Thomas, though patient, found himself battling curiosity. He told himself it was not vanity that made him long to see her face, but rather the simple need to know the woman with whom he shared a roof. Yet he did not push. He had seen in her posture a deep fear, and he would not be the one to rip away what little security she clung to. One evening, after a long day of mending fences, Thomas returned late. The house was quiet. Clara had already gone to bed, but a faint glow spilled from beneath the door of the small room where Eleanor slept. Curious, he paused. A soft murmur reached his ears. He hesitated only a moment before leaning closer. The words became clearer. Eleanor was praying. "Forgive me, Lord, for the burden I bring. Forgive me for hiding, for being less than he deserves. I cannot bear for him to see me, to see what trouble follows me. Give me strength to remain unseen, if that is my cross to carry." Her voice cracked on the last word. Thomas's chest tightened. He had expected secrets, but not such sorrow. This was not the voice of a deceitful woman hiding wickedness. This was the voice of someone crushed by shame, too heavy for one's soul to bear. Guilt pricked him for listening, yet he could not move away. He heard her breathe shakily, then whisper again, "I will serve him well. I will not shame his house." "Let that be enough." Silence followed. A moment later, the faint scrape of a chair told him she had risen, and the lamplight dimmed. Quickly, Thomas retreated down the hall, his heart pounding. That night, he lay awake, her words echoing through his mind. A burden, less than he deserves. He had never thought of Eleanor as a burden. She worked tirelessly, never complained, and carried herself with a quiet dignity. How could she believe she was anything less than worthy? The next morning, he found her in the garden, gathering beans with her usual careful movements. He wanted to tell her he had overheard her prayer, but he couldn't bring himself to confess. Instead, he knelt beside her and began picking beans into his own basket. "You don't have to work out here," he said softly. "The sun's too harsh." She shook her head. "I prefer the quiet." He looked at her hands, gloved even in the heat. "You do more than enough already." For a moment, she stilled. The veil shifted slightly as she turned her head toward him. "It is not enough," she murmured, almost too faintly to hear. His throat tightened, but he held his words. She was showing a crack in her guarded armor, small, fleeting, but real. He could not patch it with platitudes. Instead, he simply stayed beside her, helping until the baskets were full. That night, Thomas resolved to be patient, but also watchful. Eleanor's strength was a fragile kind, the kind that carried shame as though it were a sack of stones on her back. If she was to find peace here, he would need to prove himself not just her husband, but her refuge, and though she did not yet know it, the moment of vulnerability she had revealed, her whispered prayer in the dark, had planted something new in his heart. Not just curiosity, but a fierce desire to protect her from whatever ghosts haunted her past.